Kid of Arcadia. Part 5. Chapter 19. Break it, you bought it. I caught my reflection in a pawnshop window later that summer and didn't recognize it. That grubby face staring back from the black corner of the window wasn't me. It looked bony and even unshaven for the first time, even since I'd seen it in the mirror that morning. I was starving. In those weeks I learned fast just how far 200 goes when you start blowing through it in bits every day for food, and so despite getting paid I was already back to scrounging. With the guy's payout burned through on daily visits to the diner for some real food and a few plays to blow the change and 20 minutes away on their video game coin pit, every bit counted, and now we had to find our own ways of getting by again. On the other side of the glass that day a man was stepping on the pedals of some kid's bike to make the wheels spin for the guy behind the counter. The clerk slouched over, rested his chin on his palm, and blinked a blank stare as the younger man made quick gestures, his business coat stretching up his bare wrists at every opportunity. Once paid, the guy left the bike propped against the counter and busted out of the place with his handful of cash to hit the parking lot in a trot, like Dad of the Year. That was when I summoned the courage and stepped inside with a deep breath, paced on up to the glass counter, and slipped off my digital watch. Josh had told me to make sure I took it off in front of the guy because that was important for some reason. It's why I walked the distance into town that day to spend the hours searching the vacant back road drag for the place. A shrunken t-shirt was the best get-up I could assemble that morning. That watch had once been a birthday gift from Mom, but now it'd have to go if I was going to have any money of my own. I was all geared up to go buy some lunch for myself and Gus, but the clerk rolled his head and said he didn't take merchandise from kids. He said I could still buy anything I wanted, though. He pointed to the bike and told me the man who had just left kept coming in every week to sell his kids' toys to fund his drug problem, and that if I could take it off his hands he'd let me have it cheap. The pedals work, he joked. I just shook my head and slipped the watch back on. A wall sign in there read, "You break it, you bought it." I could look, but I couldn't touch anything. Fine with me, there was nothing good being offered in there anyway among the old lamps and silverware whether I had the money or not. So I wandered the narrow circle carved in the dust for a minute and then stepped back on the street disappointed. The thought of that bike sitting there in the shop was as tantalizing as it was sad, though. With it I could have traveled anywhere fast and as far away as I wanted, and could have even taken Gus with me, him hanging on the back. But there was no way I could keep something like that. Knowing that strange middle-of-nowhere town, it'd probably end up stolen and back in the shop anyways. That guy before me hadn't wasted any time getting in and out, and I knew his kid was now missing a bike. I still wanted it, though. All eyes must have been on me as I headed back to the shack that day, from the drivers pulling in and out to the people on the weedy sidewalks, from the shoppers at the grocers with their carts to the mechanics in their pits. I felt like I was being followed when I turned up the road where we were living, by a black pickup. That was the first time I saw it, in fact. Josh saved the bulk of his money that week knowing he'd be splitting soon. He wanted to make off with the most he could, but ended up spending a good chunk of it the day Gus and I accompanied him to the convenience store. We plundered the racks of snacks and candy, grabbing up every kind of morsel we could find, and threw a 20 down before the cashier all confident-like. She looked at us like a couple of yahoos, since we were all thin and filthy, but we got the goods. Then we split for the woods across the street and down some narrow forest path, taking Josh's lead when he said he knew a shortcut to carry back our bag full of sweets and 2 6-packs of pop. Back at the campsite, Josh chased some furry rodent off the grounds that was gorging on our trash, and we zipped whatever we weren't going to snack away on back in the tent. After a few silent minutes of throwing sticks in the pond and general boredom, we decided we couldn't wait any longer to ration the candy off and started tearing into the wrappers like it was Halloween night. I remember eating candy bars out in the woods quite a few times, rolling out of the sleeping bag to be met with chocolate and nougat for breakfast, which was pretty sweet. We had plenty of variety, too, and Josh always let us pick from the stack, Mars bars and you name it. By then I had no more complaints about how he chose to spend his money. In a few short weeks he'd be gone. I could have starved to death on Milky Ways in the woods, but it wouldn't have changed one thing about the world. The way I saw it, we needed our stale bread and blisters, our toothache scrapes, bug bites, and bruises. Now I could fill the holes in my soul with the dirt beneath my feet. If I was ever made to feel so small that all I wanted was somebody's something to make me bigger, all I needed now was some of that same bigness to make everybody's something smaller. Things like that made sense to me out there in the Pure Land, even at that age. I felt so much bigger than everything. There was no way to know why that creep really wanted us out of his house anymore, since all the reasons seemed long past the moment of decision, but we no longer cared. We had fully settled into our little camp. Josh was still holding out as long as he could, but as each day passed, the candy and chips finished, and as our hunger grew every afternoon, the time of reckoning seemed to be drawing nearer. Every night when the headlights shined across the pond through the distant trees, Josh readied himself to go get his turn over with and out of the way so he could take off, but nothing ever happened. The man would give us our food and turn back toward the house through the high grass without any mention of this impending work. He even got annoyed with Josh once, saying, "Enough! I'm sorry, Josh, but things can't go back to the way they used to be between us. They just can't. You're going to have to get over it." That's when Josh started sitting around sulking his days away. The kid was on the verge of tears at times now that all his hopes were up in smoke. It was all over for him, and I knew he was rethinking everything. At the same time, he knew it'd be dumb to up and split before he even had a reason to, and maybe miss his payout. He was hoping he'd have enough for a one-way bus ticket if that payout never came. But then as the days passed, he got quiet, which was weird for a loudmouth like him, and wouldn't leave the sleeping bag until noon or later. Even weirder. He'd sweat his mornings away in the tent bored out of his mind, endlessly contemplating his mistake. He admitted to me that he never should have run away again. I looked into his eyes and I could see that he was at the end. It was all over for him and there was no option left like he thought there would be. Unwilling to own up to what was written all over his face, though, he pushed on with the mistake anyways. Perhaps it was pride or love or I don't even know what, but now he insisted. He pleaded with his man every night and received nothing but a soon, not tonight, or too tired in return. Then he'd lie in the tent by himself, feeling rejected. He was losing it, but our captor was in no hurry to get rid of him. I think our man loved his boy too much to set him free. So now that Josh was in the tent all the time and Gus was out sitting on the rocks trying to slowly starve himself to death in his own directionless depression, I suddenly started finding myself all alone. So I'd be in town every afternoon asking around for food money, because unlike those other two, I still needed to eat. There was a nearby park where some of the neighborhood kids gathered to shoot hoops and swing, and I'd hang there asking random players. I'd start by cheering them on and end by putting them on to spot me some. It never worked. One afternoon I walked over to the roadside Greasy Spoon where I could see a few kids my age at the video game console through the window as I got drunk on the spice aromas in the air from the kitchen. There was little I wouldn't have done for $5. Any food would have been enough. It no longer mattered what. The lights then blinked on down the long vacant road into the sticks as the evening set in and the sun sunk below the trees. All the shadows disappeared as the sky became an orange glow, so I hiked back up the hill toward the house and decided to rest on a rock next to an overpass. For 20 minutes I sat there watching the stream of headlights below to put off going back as long as I could. I hid my last $2 down my pocket and shivered as the air grew cool and dim. The same late August haze in the azure sky I'd known since before I could remember told me that school was starting in a week or two, but I didn't think I'd ever be going again. Those kids at the Greasy Spoon knew they only had another week to squeeze in all their summer fun, so there they were playing around with those games, yet I felt I only had a few more weeks to squeeze in everything in the world. And where was I? I was sitting on a rock by a bridge. I was alone with nothing but the heavy rush of the tires on the overpass, like a cave with a breathing beast, and the vista before me. After a while of that, I picked myself up, dusted off my backside, and plodded up the road toward the house. Even then, I felt like someone was following me. That same black pickup running slow. August 14th, 1982. Dreamed about Gus, and how he was begging me to come see some big beehive in the woods. He just went on and on about how perfect it was, but I stayed where I was, in some mud pit by the lake. He left and I just got so sad. But then there was a light outside like headlights and I heard my name. Then I decided to go sit with Gus on a rock. We were singing some kind of song there. September rolled in before we knew it. The kids were back at school and the air grew moist and cool as another week passed. Sleeping on the hard tent floor now gave me backaches. The bags smelled as much as we did and each time crawling into them felt like lying down on a wet sponge. It was hardly comforting anymore. We had littered the tent floor with a layer of leaves and dried mud in the shape of 100-foot in sneaker prints. We had run out of toilet paper and living in the woods quickly lost its novelty. Enough was enough. Josh marched away toward the house in a huff one day, intent on getting out of that filth for good. He said us being out there no longer made much sense, and even if it did, he no longer cared. And he was right. It was nothing but a big joke living out there. It didn't seem like anyone really cared enough to come searching for us, and whatever that creep was doing to cover his own ass by having us out there wasn't worth it for us anymore. That's it. I'm not spending another night out in this shit. You morons can do what you want, but I'm going back inside. Fun's over, he said, packing up his bags. He stomped through the underbrush, grumbling to himself with his backpack slung around his shoulder. Gus and I didn't feel like following if he was going to be like that and figured we'd see him later anyways. There was no way he was leaving without getting his pay at that point. He had been waiting too long to throw it in now, so I didn't even think much of it at the time. He paused for a second at the ridge to stare back our way, as if expecting we'd follow him. When neither of us did, he turned and descended the other side toward the house. I watched him until he was out of sight. When the man came around that evening with our food, we told him Josh had gone inside and that he should expect getting his turn over with. The man's shoulders slumped at that news, but his eyes lit up, and the only thing he asked was why we hadn't gone with him. We just shrugged our shoulders and dug into our meals, too hungry to care about talking. That night Gus and I spread ourselves out in the tent, but we could hardly sleep. Not having Josh there made me wonder if our little troop was already about to splinter before I'd even had the chance to stop Josh from going off. That was not to be, though. When Gus and I woke the next morning, we rushed over to the house, and sure enough, he and all his things were already gone. We checked the tiny bedroom where he had slept all those nights, and there was nothing left of him. So the two of us sat around watching TV the rest of the afternoon inside the house with the memories of Josh floating around every room like ghosts. Him toasting up his bread, him bent on the couch, arm anticipating a joint, him and his snake chasing out back. He was one I had hoped to keep, and it was a shame how he seemed to have no trouble giving up whatever strained friendship we had, but that's just the way he was. My heart sank an inch each hour he didn't turn up that gray day. "Maybe he'll be back," Gus said. I was sure he'd be back if we waited around long enough, but I wasn't sure I was willing to wait. The bigger question was what Gus and I were going to do there without him. Back at the camp, things just weren't the same. We tossed around wild speculations about what had happened that night, and couldn't even rule out him being killed and buried somewhere, which was what Gus thought. It seemed likely our kidnapper must have gotten what he needed and forced Josh away so he wouldn't have to share the payout with him. I couldn't imagine Josh just up and leaving by choice before he had made anything from his time there, especially after he'd spent the bulk of his money in the build-up to getting his big payout. The gray clouds turned to a cold rain overhead that evening, and both of us quickly decided it made no sense hanging around the tent anymore. We packed up for good and ran back to the house with our bags full of clothes and threw ourselves down in the living room soaking wet before the man came home. "What's going to happen now?" Gus asked. The rain patted a drum roll on the roof as I opened the fold-out couch and spread the sheets. Gus turned the television on to break up some of the silence and sat on the rug across the room. Raindrops rolled off his cheeks on every shiver. "You still want to stay, right?" I asked. "Yeah, I don't know. I don't want to stay, but I don't want to go. We'll have to wait and see," he said. "So what does that mean?" I pressed. "What it means. Listen, man, we gotta stick together. I can't lose you too." "Well, let's just wait and see, okay?" His voice shook. "No, I need to know what you're gonna do. You're next." I sat at the end of the bed. He slumped against the wall by the television for a few minutes and swallowed his tongue, beginning to tear up as he eyed about the room. I instantly felt the old big brother instinct I must have had somewhere down inside creep up from nowhere, and I lifted off the bed to head for the bathroom, grabbed a towel from the rack, and returned to kneel beside him on the floor. He threw his face into his forearms as I curled the towel around his neck and rubbed his back like I used to do for Eliot, like Mom used to do for me. Gus was not as big-headed as Josh and I were. I had to remember that. "I should never have run away," he cried, full tears. "Yeah, but it's not like we can change that now," I said, unsure if that made any sense to him. "It's just they came and took me away in the middle of the night after Dad threw them out. They came back with the cops. They made a mistake, though. It wasn't me they were after, you know. It wasn't me. I didn't do anything wrong. I don't want to go to jail. I just couldn't live there anymore. I just couldn't be where they took me. I just wish I could go home. Yeah, same here, man, I said. He lied to me. He said I could go home, but I can't. Now there's nowhere else to go. He said, full of tears. We'll stick together, even if we have to go live on the streets, I said, knowing we'd be goners if we did that. He didn't answer. 10 minutes passed before the creep's headlights cast shadows through the windows and his car rattled up. I sprang to my feet and ran around the corner across the kitchen to tell the man we were staying inside that night, and by the time I arrived at the door he was already banging his shoes on the step. I stood there to greet him as my nerves tingled up and down my limbs, scared to talk to him for the first time without Josh around. He no longer seemed as interested in us. Hey, we're inside tonight, I said. Yeah, I saw the lights on. Here's your food, he said, and pushed out one hand clasped on 2 paper bags. I threw my arms around them and brought them to the table, nervy to even turn my back on him. He lurched toward the stove and lit the burner with a lighter from his pocket. The fact that he only had 2 bags clinched it. Josh was definitely not coming back anytime soon, but I still had enough courage to ask about it. What happened to him? He doesn't live here now. He went back, the man said. He reached over to the sink with a pot from the cupboard and ran some steaming water in it for a few seconds before dropping it on the stove. Anything to keep from looking at me. Why? I asked. Is Blondie still around? He asked. Yeah, but where'd Josh go? Are you going to eat that or what? Did he go to the city? I pressed. He pounded the countertop. I didn't let him. Gus stepped into the kitchen, rubbing his eyes, and sat at the table. And so the 2 of us had our supper in silence as the rain drummed on the roof and soaked drops here and there through the dark circles in the ceiling. The man seemed too annoyed by the turn of events to talk about what the plans were, but that's how it always was living with him. He always cut in and didn't let us speak when we had something important to ask, and then he'd just stand there cooking, washing dishes, or doing anything else so he didn't have to look at us. I was already sick of it. I was sick of him pretending he didn't care. By the end of another month, I'd grown used to smoking joints. My throat rarely gargled on the puffs and my voice wasn't cracking as before. Without Josh, we had a whole other person's rations split between the 3 of us, and we just drank it down those nights on the living room floor. One Friday I flew so hard I said I'd start writing down my dreams again, them being about all I had left, but the plans didn't carry through once I sobered up, which is the way it always is. The nights turned over cooler as we headed toward October, and the host bugs who lived above the ceiling weren't flourishing as they once were. They too had mooched off this man's house long enough, and now the nocturnal running of their 6 legs freeloading for the warmth stood no chance against the approaching seasonal shift. It made me wonder how long Gus and I had left. The 2 of us lived a dreamy life in the woods where he taught me his prayers and meditated in the day where we huddled together in the night. It was there I learned just how good a singer he really was, and I mean it. He had a beautiful, lilting singing voice, and he sang to himself songs like Peace Like a River a lot. We raised another tarp over one side of the tent to shelter it against the wind, but it could only do so much. In essence, once Josh left, we passed the point where reason made any difference anymore. It didn't matter how many hours of daylight we spent inside the house or out, and the man didn't care anymore anyways. Some nights I just didn't want to bother with that guy, so the tent was a refuge. Without his precious trophy boy son around, he rarely acknowledged us. After that many nights spent braving the wilds, you start to look upon society with a squinted eye. They left the signage glowing in the dark long after the parking lots were empty in town to guide the night travelers along the lanes, shining angel halos through the trees and spilling out drugs and food. The only 2 things I wanted most of the time. Sometimes I'd stand out in the chilled air, gaze at the stars, and really see them for what they were. They'd be dwarfed along the tree line, but still up there blazing long after the lights burned out down here. None of their neon warmth could buy me back, though. Not when I had the stars shining in the autumn night sky above. There was something more important behind it all that just began pecking away at my thoughts night after night. Going back inside the shack each day was not a major return to civilization, though, for this man lived well within his means now, rarely heating and sleeping under quilts, but sometimes it was better than being outside. Nothing could match the feeling of sitting down to a steaming bowl of condensed soup, and we would wrap ourselves in blankets around the kitchen table for warmth to dig in. Whatever money our kidnapper guy made off of Josh, if anything, He certainly wasn't sharing it with us. Then the leaves began changing, hardening bright orange and yellow near the treetops. They shed like dandelion spores in every breath of wind, and in no time covered the pond. Gus used to roll his pants up, walk to the edge of the water barefoot, and lightly tap the surface with his toes before sinking his ankles in, even when the water was freezing. Sometimes I'd join him as he made his slow journey around the edge of the pond, kicking aside rocks and splashing in the leaves. He was deeply troubled about what would become of us, but never talked about it anymore. He just sang his beautiful lilting songs for hours, and that was it. We rarely spoke, in fact, content instead to experience each other only in passing like a pair of monks going through the motions. Many an afternoon we spent sitting there on the embankment by the pond in silence, trying to match breathing patterns and pulling fluff off the cat-o'-nine-tails. As the days flew by, it felt like I was closing in on figuring things out when I was laying there watching the leaves sway gently in the breeze, almost like an otherworldly buzz or vibration that seemed to harmonize with all sounds and ripple through everything from the driest leaf tossed down on the still water to my shivering shoulders. Gus felt it even stronger. There was something about that place that seemed to soothe every trouble we had. "God is out here," he said one day while at rest, finally breaking the silence. We outfitted our sleeping bags with extra layers to weather the oncoming cold, and were able to keep surprisingly warm, but I knew it'd be senseless to stay there when the seasons really started changing. Then it didn't take long for Gus to come down with something. One day he just started coughing up yellow slime, and it continued straight on through the night, but he was ever ready to stick close by me and what he saw as God's spot on earth. That's when I moved the two of us indoors. We lay on the living room floor together, assured with a sacred handclasp before God that we'd sooner die than ever go back. By then I did believe in God, but only because of Gus, and I thought a million times more highly of him than God at the time. Then, just as I was prepared to die in the cold to preserve my dignity and take Gus with me in the process, suddenly in stepped our kidnapper with this unquestioning remorse in opening up his home and himself to us again. He even bought Gus some medicine and a portable radio, because Gus liked radios. It was odd, especially after everything that had happened, after my skin had grown tougher facing down the autumn chill, and I had given up on life, that now I was learning that I could still trust people, and him of all people. One night Gus's coughing was so bad that the man laid him up in his mattress in his bedroom and served him hot soup right off work. He actually sat at the kid's bedside serving it to him, which just blew my mind. Who the hell was this guy? Then he gave Gus a space heater that had the room toasting in no time. And so there was Gus, sitting there like a prince with his space heater and portable radio, and I was happy for him, except for the being sick part. Gus tuned all his favorite stations, the ones his stepdad used to play for him on the long car rides he'd have every summer as a little kid.
Report, instruction to undergo pre-trial mental health monitoring. Another hearing scheduled on May 9th. Our objective.
He idolized his stepdad, a black man from Trinidad, very religious, and a longtime friend of his mom. He talked about him a lot. There was one show in particular he wanted me to hear, his stepdad's favorite. "This is the guy," Gus explained, turning the radio dial. "He's been on the air for like 40 years talking about everything you need to know. Just listen. You'll learn a lot." And then came the show. From somewhere across those vast airways flew this man's voice, coming in through the scratching hiss to fill the small bedroom in the dark, so fiery and yet so reassuring. And there we both sat in silence, Gus tucked in and coughing every few seconds, and me sitting on my own cushion alongside him. I wasn't smart enough then to understand what the man was saying, and neither was Gus, so our imaginations flew faster than the speed of sound in the dark, latching onto every word pouring out that box. We absorbed all its wisdom, hoping it'd help us through to find the light of the world. The man out there on the air kept saying, "Life is worth living." That was like his mantra. At times the man's voice gargled, coughed and whined in ways no human voice should, sounding almost mechanical, like it had been processed and fed through some kind of ticker machine. Exactly who was making it was a mystery to me, but the words he spoke truly awakened me to all the errors of my thinking about God and the world, though they were hard to hear through the static sports scores and commercials cutting in from other channels. I knew when it had Gus going because that's when his breath would pick up. At times the man would speak in whispers, and then break into a shout just as we had the volume to max. There were a million distractions. I started feeling like we had stumbled onto something big here, like no one else had discovered this station before. So we kept pretty much to ourselves for a couple days as we milled over all the mysteries and conspiracies that they revealed to us on it. Every night that voice buzzed on with the show and took us both beyond everything we had ever been told. It kicked the door open in my mind to how the world wasn't what it seemed and how shadows were in control of everyone. It spoke on how real evil sits in plain sight, like the Georgia Guidestones. It talked about the demonic music and television and video games that made kids enslaved to sex and violence, the demonic state group homes they were pushing all us violent and sexually enslaved kids into, and the satanic doctors who awaited us there, ready to have us sacrificed. And so on it went. And the more I heard, the more I learned, all about what really seemed to be going on this whole time, or at least, what it all looked like once all the dots were connected. And so now it seemed there was darkness all around us and we had been part of it all of our lives, but we wouldn't let it get to us. The world was going to be ending soon, but we would survive. We had made it out. And so when the house was dark and the only sound was what came across the talk radio shows, it felt like we'd been beamed into space on some lonely craft, turning end over end, and that we'd just picked up some ancient message from something endless fathoms away. As frightening as it was, though, the silent gaps were worse. You still awake? Gus would ask sometimes when it got too quiet, just to make sure I hadn't left him all alone in the black where it was scary. I was always right there with him. At some point the light from under the door would blink on, and the man would peek in after stomping around the kitchen. He'd throw down our drive-through meals and ignore us the rest of the night. Although he got a kick out of our devotion to that radio station, he didn't even want to make small talk about it. He shirked off the words like he was trying to unhear what he was hearing, like it was his kryptonite or something. That week he slept in his living room. I brought in my sleeping bag and laid it on the floor next to the mattress where Gus had been recovering and took care of him there. Just being there was all I could do to help him pull through, though, but as the days slipped by, he seemed to be turning to snow. He melted in sweat as his forehead cooled and his cheeks paled pink. Medicine sucks. He wheezed once sitting cross-legged on the mattress and coughing nonstop, his voice still raspy. It makes it worse. I'd do better without it. Our conversations were free-range explorations like that. Sometimes they could start with something simple like, they start you early, and then we'd be off on a subject. All kinds of ideas were hatched that week between us, and I learned so much about the world, God, and Gus. Like his real name, Augustine. After holding up in that tiny room for a few days, Gus finally emerged cool, no longer sore or shaking, and totally convinced that I had healed him. He thanked me for putting all that power through whenever I touched his forehead, sure that the powers had done the trick. You did it, he told me. The thought was alluring, but I didn't take it as literal as he did. After all those years fighting to be something in the eyes of the world, all I needed was a game of make-believe to be some kind of healer. Sure, Gus had a troubled soul, but at least he was happy, and that's all that mattered to me. Okay, don't sweat it, I assured him. It was one of those things you say when you don't want to look unconverted. I believed him because that's what he wanted. I believed him because I saw no reason not to.